All right, so hello everyone. We are doing the test review video for the SAT from the College Board, practice test 397. You may have taken this in a class or with a tutor or what have you. I will be going through every single question on this test from the reading and writing side. My name is Rio. I am the lead for the humanities department here at Hamilton Education. You may have seen me in a class or with tutoring, or you may have worked with material I made and not even known it. So today, again, we're doing practice test 397, every single question, all questions coming from the College Board. So we'll begin with question number one. So question one is pretty straightforward. If you missed this question, I'm wondering if perhaps you just have difficulty working with these questions, these vocab questions where the vocab word is already in the text. It can be a little trickier that way. We always want to remember two things when we're doing this. We want to make sure that one, it fits, but two, it has the right meaning. Okay, so it has to mean both. All right, for example, you can make something clear, right? Like, let's make this clear, like that, and have the right meaning. So obvious and clear both have the correct meaning. However, does it fit the context of the sentence? No, it doesn't, right? Obvious in this case means it's something we can look through to see the bottom, okay? Um, let's make this clear can also be understandable, right? Clear can't really usually mean simple, but again, understandable is something that has the right meaning. These both have meaning, correct? But they don't fit. Whereas transparent, you can have a clear glass, right? Meaning you can see through it. It's transparent. And it has the right meaning. We know that clear can mean transparent. And it also fits in this context, meaning we can look over everything below. So if you're working through vocab questions that are in this format, remember to always be working towards fit and meaning. All right, question two is a word and context question in the typical format where we have a blank that we need to fill. Always remember that you want to have the right fit and the right meaning, like we see for the text of question one. But I do just want to iterate that this question is going to be really easy if we know sufficient vocab to get it correct. All right. What does prolong mean? Prolong means to make something longer. Um, Now, the issue, the first thing, is talking about how there are few formal options for banking and financial services. Then Maggie Lena Walker went ahead and made a savings bank. All right. Um, Did this prolong or make longer the issue of not having enough banking? No. Okay. Retain and prolong are similar here. All right. Retain means to keep something around. So that also doesn't work. Highlight would be to bring attention to something. And of course, maybe a journalist could highlight this or something like that. But rather, what she is doing is rectifying this. What does it mean to rectify? To rectify means to fix something. All right. Kind of like erect means to build something. Rectify means to fix it. So you want a word like fix or mitigate, and rectify is perfect here. If you didn't get this correct, this is just one of those vocab words that you really do have to know. And to get better at this, you're going to need to study. That's how we'll improve. All right, question three is a really good word and context question here. These are all good vocab words that we just need to know. If you're missing a question like this, what's the solution? Studying vocab on your own. That's the solution for missing a question like three. I'll explain what each of these words means, okay? To circumvent means to go around something. Okay, so let's say that there is a regulation that we're not allowed to um, put over $1 million in a single bank account. Well, you can circumvent that by putting 999,000 in one bank account and then 999,000 in another bank account. Okay, so you're getting around a certain thing. Okay, uh, so we are looking for a word here when we read the text that means to fails to line up with. okay? Or prove conclusions. All right, so doctors in the real world see certain observations in their patients, um, and then randomized clinical trials don't match up, okay? So we need a word that means match up here. Does circumvent mean match up? No, it kind of almost means the opposite. All right. Uh, disseminate. Okay, what does it mean to disseminate? That means to spread something. Particularly, usually it's like a ideological idea or a language or something like that. So, um, perhaps if you've ever had the Jehovah's Witness or you are a Jehovah's Witness, come up to your house with material for you to read to become one of the members of their church. They're disseminating materials, meaning they're giving out something to bring you to their conclusion. All right. Does that mean match up? No. Okay, now finally, implement. If you chose implement here, I think that your issue is that you don't know what corroborate means. And you want to go with something that like kind of if you squint might possibly work, but you know what it means, unlike corroborate. Okay. To implement conclusions, though, you can't really implement, I mean, you can implement a conclusion, but to implement something means to make it real, to put it into the real world, right? It's almost the opposite of what we have here, okay? This isn't clinical trials, the conclusions of clinical trials failing to be properly implemented in the real world. It's rather the real world not being supported, real world observations not being supported by randomized clinical trials. All right. So the correct word here is corroborate. What does corroborate mean? It means to basically match up with something or support something. To confirm or give support to a statement, theory, or finding is what we get from the Oxford Dictionary. Okay, that's exactly what we're looking for. Um, if you don't know this word, okay, um, you're just not studying your vocab enough. This is a word that we should know, but it's one that we probably don't know unless we've studied our vocab. So if you're missing this, the solution, study. All right, question 4 here is probably the trickiest vocab question from the College Board SAT on the first module. So we need to understand what all these words mean. If you don't know the words, you can probably produce them through what we call the 90-10 rule, meaning 90% of the time, a word is composed of roots, prefixes, or suffixes, right? If you know those roots, then a lot of times you can figure out what the word means. Okay, so reconstituted, all right? To be constituted means to be made whole, okay? So to be reconstituted means to mean you're rearranged or kind of like taken from one form and moved to another. All right. So that means radically changed. Conflated with, I'm not sure where this comes from, honestly, but it means like associated with, unwisely or non-correctly, okay, incorrectly. So we might conflate two things, uh, you know, summer and heat that don't necessarily, or like the month of June in heat, we could say, oh, June is the hottest month on the planet. But that's a improper conflation because um, it's the coldest month in other parts of the planet, right? In the southern hemisphere. Okay, so to conflate two things is to put them together when they don't necessarily belong together because you don't have enough information. Then finally, to be derived means to be kind of like produced. We know this from math, right? An answer is a derivation, right? It's like the process by which we get to an answer. Um, so to be derived from something means to come from something. Okay, in the arts, we could say that something that's derivative comes from something beforehand and is too clearly emblematic of that thing which came before. We could say that you are derived of your parents, or the situation can be derived from blah, 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 right? It's two different units and one is connected to the other, okay? So what's the only one that we didn't discuss? Demarcated. So demarcated means to like separate or separate out. I'm not sure where exactly the word comes from. But to mark means to uh, signify or claim something. So that's our correct answer here. Uh, demarcation is like a a word that is used sometimes, like a line of demarcation. It's like a way of showing distinction or difference between two things. So, diadromous fish can be made distinct from those that are merely uryaline. Okay, euryhaline. All right. Why? Because a diadromous fish is one that must migrate between freshwater and marine biomes. Okay, think of a salmon. In fact, I actually used diadromous fish in multiple instances on practice tests and practice exercises. Um, Euryhaline fish, on the other hand, are those that don't need to go between two different biomes. They just are able to, by chance, survive high salinity. So salmon can live in a highly saline, aka the ocean environment, and can live in the river because it must for its life cycle. So that means they can be made distinct from one another. If you're missing this question, simply put, you need to study more vocab, right? If you don't know all of these words, you are not strong enough to get as good of a score on the test as you need. Okay? Vocab is supposed to be one of the places where we thrive, not one of the places where we just kind of get through and survive it. Okay? Vocab is where we thrive, where we do our best. Why? Because all we have to do is study words. That's it. Okay? There's no difficulty in that other than time. So, if you're coming to this in, say, spring or summer, you have a lot of free time looking ahead of you, you finished AP test, something like that, right? Or maybe, it's winter break, whatever time you have, grind on that vocab so you get questions like 4 correct. All right, so question 5 is the first kind of real reading passage question on the test. So we have Joan Didion's memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking. The selection asks about, or the question asks about a selection from the selection. The underlined fire said we were home, we had drawn the circle, we were safe through the night. All right, so why they built fires every night. So now, what does that function in the text as a whole? It shows how the fires, though, they provided warmth, they also did something else, right? They said we were home, they had drawn the circle, meant we were safe. Okay, so it's showing safety, things like that. So A is that perfectly, right? It shows the comfort beyond simple physical war. Okay. C would be true if it asked about this here, but it asks about the other underlined part. This part is wrong for D, with or without a fire. Seems like she wants a fire. And then the information that came before it in the text, this isn't a summary whatsoever. It's clarifying what the role of fire was to Joan Didion in California. So that's how we arrived at A for question 5. Okay, question 6 is asking about the purpose of an underlined portion of text. We have a scientific passage here, meaning we are given in this case, we're given a piece of scientific jargon, right? Technical language, which usually on the SAT will be defined. Here it's defined by these parentheses, a chemical compound usable as a detergent. That's exactly what we see it is described as with question A, or answer choice A. Do we see an environmental concern from this? Nowhere specifically. Is this a scientific discovery? Yes, but do we explain the significance? No. Did the team get confused by this result? I don't see that whatsoever. So no. That's how we arrived at A for question 6. All right, so question 7 is a really good structure purpose question asking about a poem. So we're given the underlined, a slight wind shakes the seed pods. So I'm taking it that we've all read this passage already. So remember, we don't want to read beyond what the text gives us. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I think isn't really accurate in A or B. So a change in the natural environment, right? Do we see a change? Is a slight wind necessarily a change? Not any way in which we can discern specifically. Finally, responsible for the growing misgivings. It doesn't seem that this wind, if it is a change at all, is responsible for the growing misgivings, right? Rather, it seems to signify what it's like, what the misgivings are like. B, similarly, a consistency. How do we know that this slight wind is consistency? We're not given any sort of situation before or after that. So unsure as to how that could be work there. So C, again, one of our best ways of approaching these sort of questions is what is wrong with an answer choice, and is there anything, we want the answer choice that has nothing wrong with it, right? So this is an observation of an occurrence in the natural world. Perfect, right? We know that this occurs in the natural world, right? We don't know if it is a change or if it's a constant or whatever, whether it's ordinary, whether it's new, but we do know that it happens. And then the speaker expands on to convey a sense of a turbulent interior state. Perfect, right? So they expand on this idea of the seed pods being shaken. And say, this is sort of how I feel. I'm scattered in the world. I'm scattered like these hot shriveled seeds, right? Finally, with D, where do we see this common pursuit aspect in this, right? Is this made to be universal? Not according to the text, okay? You have to go by the text solely. They don't say, and like anyone else, I feel like these seeds, right? We don't have anything clearly disclosing that. So that's how we arrive to C for question 7. Make sure you're going only by the text. All right, so question 8, we are asked to describe the function of an underlined portion in the text as a whole. So in the same way that we would never understand the function of a kite if we don't consider the context of the wind, right? Or understand the context of the car's tire unless or understand the function of a car's tire unless we consider the context of a car. We can't understand the function of an underlined portion without the text as a whole. So what do we have here? We're given a caution, right? We're told that Jeremy Douglas is cautioning against certain predictions that the conventional book will eventually be pushed out by newer forms of media. Douglas, however, says, it doesn't really make sense because interactive text has existed for forever. So, they're basically saying like, newer forms of media will exist, will supplant the book. And he's like, look, the book is adaptable. It's already existed, right? So he's challenging the stance of the investors, right? We already know that he's going to do that because of up here. So always look in the context. And we get another one here, okay? So it provides the basis for a claim that he makes, but is it made by the technologists? No, that's what's wrong in B. Does he support academics over investors here, like we see in C? No. And then, do we see a technological challenge in reading early interactive texts? No, right? It's maybe a technological advancement, but it's not a challenge presented in reading these texts. It's something we've always done. So remember, always look for what's wrong in answer choices to get rid of at least 3. And then you can proceed to finding which one is correct. In this case, A. All right, so question 9 is a really good kind of command of evidence question. Okay, we are being asked to make a logical claim based off of details from the text. Okay, so what does the text say? The text says that baby octopus, rather, really like to be at this one spot called the Octopus Garden. Here they have adults who maybe could have kids, hatchlings and eggs, but there are no juveniles present. Okay, so no juveniles present. So what do we know? We know that they like the warm temperature, right? And that it is likely reproductive benefits and it's used for reproduction because once they're old enough, they get out of there. So A is supported in the text, right? This is directly supported between A and what's underlined, no juveniles are present. Okay. B, do we see variations in water temperature in the text? No, we don't know whatsoever. There are water variations elsewhere, but next to the Octopus Garden, you know, we don't know exactly. And then also we don't know if their population remains stable, right? So no direct correlation for B. Do we see a fewer but larger eggs thing anywhere? No, not sure. That would be supported. And now, we know that the Octopus Garden is ideal for something, but is it ideal for these hatchlings? Feeding? We don't know if it's ideal for feeding, okay? So we know that it's probably good for reproduction, but do we know if it's good for feeding? Not directly mentioned in the text. But we do know directly in the text that whether they're eaten, whether they swim away, whatever, there are no juveniles present, meaning once they get to an intermediate stage, they are gone. All right, so for question 10, we are asked to make a logical inference from a selection of the text, The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. So we hear that there's this story of this Hans Castorp, who is perfectly ordinary. So we hear about his story because the story itself is very interesting. Very much worth telling. Although, because it is his story, he also is kind of interesting too, right? So he's ordinary, but because this story happens to him, he's interesting. And that this story took place a long time ago, so therefore, we have to use verbs from the olden days, all right? So it has to be written like it's from the olden days, and it's a good story, even though the person is very ordinary, but of course, his life isn't that ordinary because the story happens to him. Okay, that's what this text says. All right, so what do we know about Hans Castorp? Well, we know that generally speaking, he is perfectly ordinary, though something interesting happened to him. All right. So I'm going to underline some things that are incorrect in all the incorrect answer choices, right? So all people are unique. Does the text say this anywhere? No. All right. If you're selecting this is a baggage distractor, okay? You might think everyone is an interesting person. You might think all people are unique, right? But does the text say this? And does this relate to Hans Castorp? Nowhere directly. Now, B, this is a story of a person of no particular significance. Okay, that's sort of attested to in the passage. But does it say that because of how old it is and the way it's told, that's why it's important? No. It says that the thing is important because it seems interesting, right? It doesn't say it's interesting because it's old. It's just that it is old and it is interesting. Those are two uncorrelated factors. Finally, does that tell us anything about Hans Castorp? No. Finally, with C, what's wrong with C? Basically, we are not told that ordinary people stories must be told in a way to make them consequential. This doesn't say anything about all, right? So this, like all stories, this doesn't say every story about an inconsequential person must be told in an antiquated fashion so as to have some significance attached, right? So this is what I just said is what C is saying, which doesn't make any sense. So now why is D correct? Is a remarkable story that happened to an unremarkable person. Okay, so yeah, he's unremarkable. That doesn't mean he's awful, it just means he's ordinary. So a remarkable story happened to an unremarkable, or an extraordinary story happened to an ordinary person. Although you could say that because the story is interesting, the person's probably interesting too. All right, so that's how we get to D for question 10. All right, 11 is a great and difficult question here. We are asked that we to find a quotation mark or a quotation that supports the student's claim. So what is the student's claim here? The student's claim is that Aristotle asserts that in a healthy state, obedience to law must be as close to absolute as possible, and that even minor infractions should not be ignored. So basically, the student says that Aristotle said, so this isn't the student's claim, this is Aristotle's claim. The student is claiming that Aristotle claimed this. Aristotle claims that in a healthy state, you must follow the law perfectly, and minor infractions cannot be ignored. All right. So which answer choice shows this most of all? Okay. A does. Why? Okay. Transgression means breaking the law. So transgression ruins the state. And to allow transgression is like letting small expenditures chip away at a fortune until it is depleted. All right. So this metaphor that small transgressions, small expenditures will chip away at a fortune is the same claim as small breaking of the rules will ruin a state. Okay. So that is how A and the student's claim are connected. I want to talk a little bit about why some of these other ones might be interesting to us, but why they're wrong. All right. So we talk a little bit about oligarchies, right? And stability. Okay, so it is true that answer choice D, right, talks a little bit about oligarchies because of certain situations, and oligarchies show up here. But this doesn't connect to this, all right? Our claim, our students' claim about how breaking laws leads to the dissolution of a state is not connected to D. All right. Same with C. C is not connected to this claim, though it seems to be connected to some degree with this here. All right. And then finally, avoiding corruption. Corruption in government. Do we see any sort of commentary on the breaking of laws directly here? No, right? So he says that oligarchies, again, a recycled language distractor shows up, but we're not talking about breaking the law. So for this one, I would really mention, watch out for recycled language distractors. All right. We see recycled language distractors in both answer choice D and answer choice B. So that's how we arrive to the correct answer choice of A for question 11. All right, so 12 is a command of evidence thing. We are looking to directly support the researcher's conclusion. All right, so what is the researcher's conclusion? Their conclusion is that there is an observable pattern shift in the time of reference when a story takes place, okay, because of electric lighting. So what does that mean? Basically, after light reference to time/clocks. Before electricity, reference to sun and not clocks. Okay, so basically, before electricity, we would talk about dinner time. Now, after electricity, we talk about 7 p.m. Okay, so which answer choice would show that? All right, answer choice B. Okay, so earlier periods don't mention or couldn't possibly mention things taking place after when there are particular times of the day, right? So this would most directly support their conclusion that after electricity in the late 19th century, we have more time references, right? So what's wrong in A? Less often. What's wrong in C? That implied time references become more common. Okay, so those are both opposite distractors. And then finally, D doesn't compare before and after, it compares all. So we don't have the right comparisons to make a logically cohesive claim. So that's how we arrive to B for a passage which basically says that these people came to a conclusion that after the advent of electricity, novels began talking about time. And before the advent of electricity, they talked about time in a reference thing to things like dinner or the sun or what have you. So that's how we arrive to B for question 12. All right, so question 13 here is a tricky command of evidence graph question, quantitative question. One thing I want to point out here that makes sense, okay? So we have a percentage attribution as our y-axis. That means these will always add up to 100, okay? So this is always out of 100. Now, what is this saying, okay? Or what does this mean? It basically means between region 1 and region 2, it is asking to what degree does ULE, okay, what does ULE mean? Land expansion, urban land expansion. Is that attributed to either increases in GDP, okay, so how much production per person, or is that attributed to population growth, okay? So the percentage of ULE, right? So ULE, again, meaning land expansion, so how big a city is. And region 2, at one point, was primarily caused by the one on the left, which is how much the population was growing. But then from 2000 to 2014, the majority is it really switched to being even, right? So and then in region 1, it's kind of the opposite. It seems like as we've gone through time, the expansion of the city, urban expansion, is driven more by population growth than by GDP. Okay, so what do we need to know about these studiers, okay, these people? Mata et al. Proposed that absent other factors, which is a classic thing economists say to mean absolutely nothing. Someone who got an econ degree, there's no dumber person on the planet than an economist. They're, you know. Anyways, so they say absent other factors, the importance of GDP growth in ULE, right? So the importance of GDP for urban expansion would increase as governments become more efficient. So if a government becomes more efficient, according to Mata, then GDP is going to take a bigger proportion of ULE, urban land expansion. So like we see in region 2, from 1970 2000 to 2000 2014, according to Mata, that would be explained by an increase in efficiency, right? Because now GDP is more proportionally responsible for urban land expansion than population growth is, okay, or was back from 1970 to 2000. So on the other hand, it would mean the exact opposite for region 1, because region 1 shows that urban population growth is now more responsible or more proportionally responsible for urban land expansion. So the growth of the city as a size, right? The footprint of the city is growing more as a consequence of population growth than GDP in a less efficient government. In an efficient government, the footprint of a city expands more as a consequence of the GDP as opposed to the population growth, okay? So we need an answer choice then to complete the statement that says either region 2 saw marked increases in government efficiency, right? As a whole, or we would need to say that region 1 experienced relative declines in efficiency from period 1 to period 2, right? So either region 2 increase in efficiency from period 1 to period 2, or region 1 decrease in efficiency from period 1 to period 2. So A says one of those, right? A says from period 1 to period 2, region 1 experienced a decline in efficiency, right? How do we know? Because urban population growth grew as a proportion of how responsible it was for city footprint expansion. Okay. Now, B and D, neither of those make any sense going on, right? So increasing government efficiency in region 1, disproven. Okay. Increasing efficiency in region 1, disproven. Now, C is interesting, right? Because we see governments in region 2 became more efficient in the period from 2000 to 2014 than they did in 1970 to 2000. If it stopped right there, I would say yes to C. But those of several countries in this region did not. We have no idea how this claim, which is part of the answer choice, is supported. So if you chose C, you're choosing a half-right distractor. Majority of this answer choice is right, but part of it is wrong. In any part of an answer choice being wrong is the poison that makes the answer choice unable to work. So that's how we arrive to A for this tricky question 13. Make sure you're really just keeping track of jargon and understanding the things logically and really reading what every component of a graph does. All right, question 14 is a very tricky, very good reading question here. Command of evidence. Okay, so our graph shows how much of an imports are made by China from the period 2000 to 2006 by type. And then we see different ways in which those imports are processed, or what category these are, okay? So some of these imports are just coming in directly as imports, and an ordinary import meaning like, you know, just a normal good. Then some are processed with assembly, and some are processed with inputs, okay? So what is the difference between processing with assembly and processing with inputs? Well, processing with assembly means that a company obtains raw materials from a foreign trading partner without payment, okay? And then sells the final goods to that partner, charging for assembly. Meaning, basically, that they don't have the money to buy the imports. They just receive the imports to process them on the cheap because of low labor costs, we can presume, and then selling them back to the partner, meaning they basically only make the money for the assembly. They're not actually buying the good to transform. Now, that is processing with assembly, okay? Processing with inputs means you actually expend capital to buy raw materials, processing them into final goods, and then sell those goods to whichever trade partner it chooses. All right, so we can imagine company A doesn't have enough money to spend to buy the materials that would produce this pen, okay? So instead, they're given the raw materials for this pen. Their labor, which they pay low wages, produces the pen. And then the pen goes directly back to the person that gave them the raw materials for the pen. All right, that would be what company A does. Company B, on the other hand, would buy all the raw materials for this pen, use their labor to produce the pen, and then sell the pen to whoever offers the best price for the pen. So according to the student who is researching this, trade liberalization was shaped by limited capital that was resolved during the 2000s. Okay, so how do we know that capital is a function here whatsoever? Because I'm going to highlight both of these. Expending capital, limited capital. Okay, so you need capital for processing with inputs, but if you have limited capital, you're not able to process with inputs because you can't buy the raw materials for this pen. You have to have the raw materials given to you ahead of time so that you can pay back with the finished product. All right, so basically, processing with assembly means you are paying the company with the goods you make and charging the price of assembling those goods. Processing with inputs means you pay with money or capital to buy those imported raw materials and then transform them into a literal product that you then sell on the open market. All right, so what do we see that proves the student's assertion that limited capital was an issue until all of a sudden it wasn't through the 2000s? Well, probably the fact that processing with inputs has a really sharp curve in terms of its growth compared to processing with assembly, which has a curve that looks more like this, okay? So looking at the slope of these lines, we see, look at how much sharper processing with inputs grew over the course of this period. That therefore will suggest that because the slope is higher, liberalization through processing with inputs increased because now there's no longer an issue of limited capital. All right, so that is how we get to answer choice B, okay? Yeah, so that's how we answer question 14. All right, so 15 is an inference question that is easier than it seems once we understand what all of these jargon terms mean. Okay, so we're talking about creep, okay? Creep means a high rate of creep. All right, so we have creep rate. A high creep rate means it deforms quickly. What is it? It is high performance material, okay? So material with high creep means it's going to destroy itself quickly, right? When at in high performance. A material with low creep means it will deteriorate slower, okay? So high creep means it deteriorates quickly. Low creep means it deteriorates slowly. How do we know that? By reading the text, okay? So now at the very least, we understand the jargon that we're dealing with, okay? Now, what is the other bit of jargon? We have 2-polymer versus nitrogen treated, okay? So nitrogen treated has slower creep or lower creep than 2-polymer, okay? So that means nitrogen rated, now that we know that lower creep means it deforms slower, has a lower creep than 2-polymer, meaning nitrogen treated is going to get broken slower. It's going to stand up to these issues of high performance longer than a simple 2-polymer fiber. Okay, so nitrogen treated stronger than 2-polymer. What shows that? D. Okay, they have higher creep rate, which means they have a ability to withstand monoclonal stress for a longer period. Okay, so that is how we arrive to D for question 15 on this. Our incorrect answer choices. We don't know about this here, right? Unlike these, and temperatures and loads being consistent, we don't know these sort of situations according to A, okay? And then B says that they would be the same, similar potential, but in reality, we're saying that nitrogen treated is going to be stronger or better in terms of creep. And then finally, C would say that 2-polymer is better than nitrogen treated, which is an opposite distractor. So that's why the others are wrong, and that's how we arrive to the correct answer of D. With that, we move on to the writing portion of Module 1 of Test 397. All right, moving on to the grammar portion, or the writing portion, excuse me, of Module 1 of Test 397. We have this question here asking about subject-verb tense agreement, or verb tense. So we need to make sure that we are in the correct tense here. So we see, are they reached? We see was, we see all these suggestions, meaning we're in the simple past tense. So our correct answer must also be in the simple past tense, affected. All right. A would mean that they're doing it right now. B would mean in the future. C would mean in the future. So that is how we arrive to D for question 16. All right, so 17, we have something of a punctuation question. We are asked, how do we combine two independent clauses? All right, so from These ingenious to calculators is an independent clause. It means it could be its own sentence. And then from Leibniz to century could also be its own sentence, meaning it's also an independent clause. So what are our three rules for combining independent clauses? We can use a period, we can use a semicolon, or a colon if it's an elaboration after, or we can use a comma with a coordinating conjunction called a fanboys. All right, so A doesn't do anything, which is wrong. D doesn't do anything, which is wrong. All right, so if you missed this question, I'm supposing you probably chose B because there's a comma here. But remember, just a comma is not sufficient to connect to independent clauses, right? So because both of these clauses are independent, that's how we arrived at C, where we have our comma, good, and then our coordinating conjunction, which is also a way we can remember coordinating conjunctions, is the acronym FANBOYS. So for, and, nor, but, all right? So that's how we arrive to answer choice C for question 17. All right, so question 18 is a question asking about subject-verb agreement. But it also is asking something along the lines of punctuation, even if we can't tell. All right, so I just want to show what I think would be the two most common wrong answers here, which would be D or A. All right, so why is B incorrect? B is incorrect because it's clearly the wrong tense, because this is saying that this would be in the future. A type of Chinese landscape painting will be characterized by the use of all these things. We're not in the future, okay? So D and A are not wrong because of their timing, okay? It's not because of the timing of their tense. Rather, it is because they suggest, both of them, that from here to here is from A type to landscapes is an independent clause. That's what A and D suggest. But from a type of Chinese landscape to landscapes is not an independent clause. It is a dependent clause, right? It's explaining what comes before. We can thus only connect it with a comma. We cannot connect it with a semicolon or a period or what have you, which is what we see here. Because it's connected with a comma, that means we cannot say is or has been, okay? That means what that would do, why it's wrong, is it would make a new subject, okay? It would make the subject the type of Chinese landscape painting. But rather, the subject needs to be Panorama of Mount Lu. All right, so the subject is Panorama of Mount Lu. So we cannot change the subject after that comma, because then we need a new independent clause. So that's what makes A and D wrong. Therefore, we have to go with C because it becomes innate and natural to the sentence. It cannot be separated out. So that's why we're allowed to put it there, because we already use a comma, right? So make sure you're reading the whole text if you're missing a question like 18. It's pretty easy to only read a type of Chinese landscape painting, blah, 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 right? And think, so it has to be A or it has to be D. But once you read the whole sentence, you now see what the real subject is. You see that we're not using a semicolon or a period. Therefore, we have to keep the subject the same between these two units of language. And the way we can do that is with answer choice C. All right, so if you miss 19, I think you missed a very operative word, which I'm going to underline, a very important word to determining this question, which is right here, though. All right. This though, which I underlined, is a transition between our first clause, what increases is the rate at which the water turns to vapor, and our second clause. With a pressure cooker pot, though, an airtight seal traps the vapor in the pot, creating pressure that allows the temperature of the water to increase past its boiling point. Okay, so because we can see that these are two different independent clauses, by virtue of this though, and we see that our subject changes between the two independent clauses, we know we need to do our proper connection of two independent clauses. What are we allowed to do? Well, we could use a comma and a fanboys. They both need to be present, all right? So when we're looking at D, what's missing? We have our fanboys, but we don't have a comma. So therefore, we can't use D. C, we have our comma, but it's missing. are fanboys, so we can't use C. Our other options would be a semicolon, which I don't see, or a period, right? Which is what A does. All right, B is wrong because it's just a simple run-on. So how can we tell that these are different? Because of that word the. So this is an example of why on the SAT, for these grammar questions, you do need to read the whole text. If you're not reading the whole text, you're going to run into problems. All right, so question 20 is what we call a modifier question, meaning we're trying to figure out what is the thing or the noun that is doing this wanting, okay? Whatever is doing the wanting, okay, whatever is performing the verb, whatever subject is performing the verb, wanting, needs to be right here. Okay, so the subject needs to be next to the verb that is doing. Okay, so who or what is wanting to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Alaska Purchase? Okay, well, the thing which wants to celebrate it is the Alaska Centennial Commission. Okay, so the Alaska Centennial Commission is what needs to go right there, which is why D is correct. Okay, A would suggest that the contest wants to celebrate the 100th anniversary, but that doesn't make any sense, right? B would suggest that an award would want to celebrate the 100th anniversary, which doesn't make any sense. And C would suggest that $300 would want to celebrate the anniversary, which doesn't make any sense. It's only the Alaska Centennial Commission which is capable of wanting to celebrate the 100th anniversary. So remember, with these questions, we are not being asked what sounds the best, which is usually the trap I think students fall into when they miss questions like this. Rather, we're looking for which puts the right subject close enough to the action that it's performing in the modifier, as the modifier. So that's how we get to D. All right, so 21 is a very tricky one, but I want to remind us of something, okay? Sentences are not sentences. Well, let me put it like this. We don't use periods because something feels quote unquote long, right? A run-on sentence is not a run-on sentence, quote unquote, just because it's long. A run-on sentence happens when we try to put two independent clauses together without any sort of signification that we have two different independent clauses, meaning we're not using our proper punctuation marks to separate independent clauses. A run-on is not just a long sentence. A very short sentence can be a run-on. Rio is tall. Rio is a teacher, okay? It's only 7 words there, but it's a run-on sentence. You can also have a very long sentence not be a run-on. 21, this is not a run-on sentence, okay? This is a correct, all one sentence. It all should be one sentence. Okay, what does the sentence say? Tools provide evidence that interactions happened earlier than previously thought, which, if true, would overturn current theories. All right. So, why can this not be 2 sentences? Okay, because a finding that would overturn current theories about migration during the Upper Paleolithic is not a clause. It's not a clause at all. Why? It is only a noun. All this is saying is that it is a finding. Okay. So we know that we cannot have those be its own sentence. Another clue. Notice that B and A do the exact same thing, right? We can't use B or A because they do the exact same thing that the other one does. A semicolon and a period are interchangeable in terms of connecting independent clauses. So my correct answer here is D, because we just have an embedded transition that elaborates on what came beforehand using a comma, which is perfectly acceptable. All right, so that is how we arrive to D. C would create an unclear noun. We couldn't know if it was earlier than was previously supposed a finding. That would mean a previously supposed a finding. That's not what the noun is, right? So we need to separate the two nouns there using a comma. So that is how we arrive to D as opposed to A, B, or C. Remember, a period or a semicolon isn't about length. It is about whether we have new units of language, meaning a clause. All right, so 22 is a transitional question. All right, we want to think about the categories of transitions we have, which are additional information, cause and effect, a pivot, emphasis or evidence, time, things like that, conclusion. In this case, we are just giving additional information. Guard cells do several things. One, they regulate the amount of carbon dioxide. Two, they regulate water loss. So we want to use an additional information transition category here, which would be additionally. These other ones do not work because they change things up, right? In conclusion would mean that the first one causes the second. Not true, not shown. Instead would mean that the first one doesn't happen and something else happens. Not true, not shown. Previously would mean that the second one happens before the first one. Not true, not shown. So that's how we get to A, additional information category for a transition. All right, so 23 is a really straightforward rhetorical synthesis question. If you're missing a question like this, you really need to read the question stem more clearly. We just want to indicate where the short story takes place. So where does your short story take place? It takes place in Harlem. Which answer choice shows this? A, it says the thing takes place in Harlem. If we're not doing that, we're missing this question. We're moving far too fast on this rhetorical synthesis. I mean, we probably took too much time somewhere else in this test. All right, so 24 is a rhetorical synthesis question, meaning we really need to look at them, focus on the question. So we're trying to contrast the two styles of tiles, meaning we want to show the difference between these two styles. So how do we do that? Well, we see that the Majolica, they are painted directly on the ceramic, whereas in Artista, they are stamped. So we need an answer choice which says Artista is stamped, Majolica is painted, and that shows the difference, right? A doesn't contrast them, it just says that they both exist. B doesn't contrast them, it just says that they are both famous for intricate tile work. C contrasts them, right? Because we say Artista are stamped and Majolica are painted directly. So C is right. And then D, again, it just says that they exist with the Majolica and how the Majolica is made, but they don't talk about the Artista. So that is how we arrive to C for question 24. All right, so question 25, we are asked to do something pretty simple here. We are asked to contrast these songs. So what is difference between the two songs, Poor Miner's Farewell, which is about wages and dangerous living conditions, working conditions, versus Bringing Him Back Home, which is about Nelson Mandela. So we need to contrast. A brings them together. It shows similarities, which is cool. It's cool that they're similar, but that's not what the question asks for us to do. Okay. B does a good job of contrasting them, right? It says one is about coal miners and the other is about Nelson Mandela. Great. C, we have Bring Them Back Home, but is Poor Miner's Farewell there? No. D, we have Poor Miner's Farewell, but do we have Bring Them Back Home? No. So that is how we arrive to answer choice B for question 25. All right, so for 26, a tricky word rhetorical synthesis question. We are asked to challenge Thucydides' explanation for the conflict between Athens and Sparta, right? So there's a theory about a rising power threatening to displace a ruling power causes conflict that is based off of the conflict between Athens and Sparta. So logically, we can infer that Thucydides' explanation for Athens and Sparta's fight is because one was rising in power and threatening to displace a ruling power, causing conflict, right? Here we see the rise of Athens instilled fear in Sparta, causing an inevitable battle. Okay, so we want to say that it wasn't this, it was something else. All right, so A does a good job of explaining the Thucydides trap, but it doesn't show why it's wrong in explaining Athens and Sparta. B explains how Stuart it explains that Stuart did challenge the historical claim, but do we have a quote that challenges the claim? No. This quote doesn't challenge the claim, it supports the claim. C, now we get a quote that supports the claim, refuting Thucydides' explanation. So that's why C is correct. And finally, D, we have the wrong issue because Allison doesn't disagree. It's rather Stuart who disagrees. So this is a classic SAT rhetorical synthesis trap where an answer choice uses information incorrectly from the passage. So that's how we arrive to C. All right, so 27, we're asked to give an overview of the study's findings. All right, so we want to focus on the findings here. So what are the findings? So basically, our finding is that we basically have the same rate of IR, meaning information conveyed per second, information rate, across all 17 languages, despite the number of syllables spoken. So no matter how fast you speak syllables, you convey the same amount of information in the same span of time. So this is the biggest finding. So it's got answer choices and I have to say something along the lines of, despite differences in syllables, IR is the same. Okay. So A, we don't actually get the finding. We just say that they determined the IR, but they didn't say what that meant. Okay. Now B is an incorrect characterization, right? Researchers found that information was conveyed more quickly in Spanish. Information here is wrong. That would need to say syllables. That's the SR, right? Not the IR. So B is saying the IR is different, but the IR is the same. C, this part here is what's wrong. Do we know that Spain had a lower information rate of the two? No. Why not? Because they all have the same general information rate, which is how we arrive to D, where even though they differed in the number of syllables spoken per second, like the difference between Vietnamese and Spanish, they all had roughly the same IR. All right. So that's how we arrive to D for question 27 and how we finish the writing section for module 1 of test 397. All right, question 1 here on module 2 is a pretty straightforward word and context question, vocab question. So we're talking about the Azores, which shout out my ancestors who are from the Azores. In the Azores, they planted hundreds of thousands of native trees in order to boost native birds' population. And then this approach was something. We see that their population size increased from as few as 100 to as many as 1,300. So we want to say that it was successful, that it worked out, right? I can't imagine missing this in any way other than, I can and certainly imagine how we missed this, right? The only way I think we could have missed this, though, is if we were moving too quickly. I think if we gave this question the time it deserved, this one would be one we would probably all get correct. But if you're moving too quickly, it's pretty natural to make a mistake here. So just make sure you're giving every question, especially the easy questions, the credit they deserve, because missing an easy question is no, like, you get as much detriment from missing an easy question as missing a hard question. And you get as much benefit from getting an easy question correct as getting a hard question correct. So don't give up on these or think they're unimportant. They're very important to your score. Right, so for number two, we have a word and context vocab question. We're looking for something to be like an anomaly or out of the ordinary, because typically a neutron merger only lasts, a burst from a neutron merger only lasts for 2 seconds, but in this case, it lasts for 200 seconds. So it's much longer than normal, out of the norm. So oddity is perfect for that, right? A coincidence means two things happening coincidence, right? An incident meaning a moment, and meaning they're happening at the same time. A reprieve means a break. Okay, we've actually seen this on one of the Hamilton tests. And then an incident, like a coincident, is just something happening, right? So though it is an incident, it isn't what we're trying to suggest with the logic of this passage, which is an oddity. So make sure you're reading the whole passage if you're missing a question like two. Okay, if you're not reading the whole passage, I can see how we can miss a question like this. All right, so question three is the last vocab question on the test and on module two. Pretty straightforward here. We're basically saying that Benjamin Franklin was popular in France, which was helpful in getting France to assist the United States. Why, what does this mean, popular in France? We're looking for something that has a similar connection. Esteem works here, okay? Many of you have taken Spanish. You might know that as a salutation, or hello, you'll say like, to the esteemed, Rio, that's my name, okay? Meaning like held in high regard, right? So self-esteem means holding yourself in high regard. So general esteem means everybody holds you in regard. If you chose thoughtfulness here, you're going too far in terms of trying to translate like, well, if he's popular in France and he's a smart guy, it's probably because of his thoughtfulness, right? Or perhaps because of his sincerity. And controversy doesn't make sense because he's popular there, even though French sometimes like controversial people. There's no anything in the passage to suggest that. So if you didn't know the word esteem, you might avoid choosing it. But thoughtfulness, controversy, and sincerity, none of those work here. If none of those work, you're going to have to choose esteem, even if you don't know what it means. So that's how we arrived to that for question three. All right, moving on to question four here on module two, a reading question. We are asked what the underlined sentence does for the text as a whole. Like, what's the function of this underlined sentence in the text as a whole? So we have to understand the whole text. Okay, you can't understand what the engine of a car does unless you look at the car as a whole. So many scientists at the time believed that the ocean floor was mostly flat, right? So what do we see? Well, Marty Tharp and her research partner, Bruce Heasine, proved that this idea was wrong. Okay, so that seems pretty clear of a way to identify what this is, which is A. Okay, is the design of their experiment that it's flat? No. Did Tharp and Heasine disagree on this? No. And no. It is a claim that they made, but the opposite, right? So they didn't make the claim that it was flat. That's what other people made at the time. Their claim was that it was filled with canyons, mountains, and valleys. So that's why we arrived at A for question four. All right, so question five is asking us to understand the function of the underlined phrase in the text as a whole. We have to know the whole text in order for us to understand the function of the underlined phrase, even though it's just a part. So what does the text as a whole say? Well, it says that in the early days of television, people thought that TV programs would get their money from advertising, but advertisers were hesitant. Why? Because new TVs were not being made because of World War II. So broadcasters had to try to convince advertisers that they could they'd get value from putting their commercials on TVs, even if they didn't know how many TV viewers there would be because of World War II. Right? So the because of World War II part of all of this is produced by this underlined portion of the sentence here. So our answer choice needs to align with that, right? The because of World War II, right? It provides a reason for why we didn't know whether advertising would take off with television. So what does that do? That lines up with B, right? A is too broad. Okay, the beginnings of television and the beginnings of radio, like we're talking about the beginnings of television to some degree in a limited sense, but we're not talking about the beginnings of radio in a broad sense. We're not talking about what kind of programs or anything like that, just limited advertising notion. Um, Now, this passage as a whole is about how broadcasters attempted to convince advertisers to support television, right? But is this section here about that? No, that's why advertisers were reticent or nervous about it. Okay. And then finally, we don't see any type of television programming, so that's how we can get rid of D, and that's how we arrive to B for question 5. All right, so question 6, we're asked to understand the function of an underlined sentence within a text as a whole. So as is the case on any of these questions, we need to know the text as a whole in order to understand the underlined portion, right? So what does the text as a whole say? Basically says that the Bayeux Tapestry was really, really big, okay? And it was joined by workers embroidering in sections and stitching those sections together. Then it says basically, uh, because the workers had never made such a big version of a tapestry, they had to learn as it went along, right? At first, I mean, it was something that they had to refine as they went through the course of production. Then our final sentence gives a proof or support, a warrant for how this is seen. Okay. How do we know this? Well, the first time the workers joined these panels together, it really didn't look good, right? There's a clear misalignment. But then later on, it's virtually invisible, these joins, right? They're really good. So they learned how to do it as time went along, right? So what is the function of that underlined sentence then? It isn't asking what it says, it's asking what was its purpose. Its purpose was to support the argument, right? It gives the evidence. Okay. Clearly, A is wrong because we don't learn anything about the people in it. Um, C is wrong because we don't get anything about other tapestries. And then D is wrong. So determine something about the Bayeux Tapestry, but not where it was produced. All right. So that's how we arrive to B for question 6. All right, so with these cross-text connection questions, like we see on 7, we need to make sure that we are using the texts to come up with the quote-unquote likely responses. Okay, so the questions always or typically ask something along the lines of, how would the author of one of the texts most likely respond to claim in the other text, right? So here we're asked, how would the author of text 2 most likely respond to what, quote unquote, some researchers contend as described in text 1? Okay, so what do the researchers contend in text 1? That tectonic movements began around 3 billion years ago, according to modeling, right? According to computer modeling, right? So, Uh, what could text 2 say about this? Well, text 2 does say about something about this, right? What do they say? Any plausible claim about the inception at the beginning of tectonic movement must rest on empirical evidence from the geological record. Okay, I'm going to double highlight this. Must rest on empirical evidence from the geological record. Now, what does that mean? Must rest on empirical evidence. That means physical evidence from the geological record. What's an example of what they would want from that? Well, geochemistry of zircon crystals, right? So that shows the actual geological record. So why is D correct? Okay. Uh, well, and then we see here this too, 4.2 billion years ago is what they suggest. A more definitive form of evidence, right? According to text 2, the most definitive form of evidence that we can have isn't computer models. It is geological record. Okay. So A, where do we see anything in the second text about the temperature of the Earth's mantle being insufficient? We don't see that anywhere in text 2, so we can't say that that's what they would say. Um, B, okay, so this part, by distinguishing between computer models is kind of interesting, but then it's saying between computer models and themselves, right? Saying one computer model to another computer model. It doesn't ask us to compare between computer models and actual geological empirical evidence. Finally, we have the final part of C is wrong, saying much more reliable than their predecessors. He doesn't talk about, or the author of text 2 doesn't talk about uh, computer modeling whatsoever, other than to, in the abstract, say the only thing that can give us a real claim is geological record, not modeling, only geological record. So that's how we arrive to D for this cross-text connection question 7. All right, question 8 is a pretty straightforward, detailed question we would call, because it asks us something about the text, right? It asks, what does the text say, or where in the text, according to the text, something like that, right? So what does the text say is helpful about the process of making rubber? Uh, for this, what feature of this tree is helpful according to the text? Well, um, here we see this text, this tree is helpful, right? What part of it? The bark. Okay. So we need an answer choice that refers to the bark. Okay. The only answer choice that even refers to the bark is B. Right now, let's just double clarify what is it about the bark that's helpful? Well, it has a unique structure that makes it easy to collect latex, right? Well, that's exactly what B says. So that's how it's helpful. Um, A, do they talk about high quality latex or high quality rubber? No, compared to anything else, no. Do they talk about the climactic variety of where it's able to grow? No. Do they talk about other trees in the Amazon that produce latex? No. Right, so that's how we arrive to B for question 8. Watch the movie Fitzcarraldo. All right, so question 9 is a main idea question. All right, we see that right here. These main idea questions require us to find ultimately the thesis in this passage. Okay, there can be multiple things that are shown in a passage that are true that don't necessarily equate to the main idea. So I'm going to highlight where the main idea is stated in the text as a thesis, right? Um, so we are working to protect ecosystems from habitat destruction and biodiversity loss. And what's a good thing that to do that? Natural features address these challenges. So, to help protect ecosystems from habitat destruction and biodiversity loss, and if we want to use natural features. Okay, so that's what the main idea is, because that is the thesis of this passage logically. All right, so I'm going to show, for example, answer choice A. Uh, it looks like there is a fruitful collaboration that is helping biodiversity. A seems to be true, okay? But is this relevant to the main idea of the text? Yes. But is it the main idea of the text? No. Okay. It proves the main idea of the text, the connection between the Quinault Indian Nation and the Wild Salmon Center. But really, what's the proof here is this, okay? So, the importance of collaborative approaches is not the thesis. It is not the thesis. It's not talked about explicitly in the passage. It can't be the main idea, right? C, similarly, C is true in the passage. C certainly helps salmon thrive and reproduce, right? Log jams are able to do that. But what is this? This is an example of the main claim. This isn't the main claim itself, all right? Now, finally, D. Okay, nature-based conservation methods are good, but do they make this comparative here in the text? No, right? They're not saying other methods are less effective. They're just saying that this is an effective method. So ultimately, B is correct because it directly lines up with the thesis at the beginning of this question, of this passage. And that's what we have to find for these main idea questions, the thesis. All right, so question 10 is a very straightforward command of evidence question. We are asked to show something that proves the claim. All right, so what is the claim? That Eckelmann sculptures are really durable, even though they are delicate looking. All right, so durable, but despite looking delicate. So we want to say that they're very durable. All right, so which quote will say these things are either delicate but durable, or they look like a breeze, or they are very durable, right? Something like that. C. Okay, clearly C says her sculptures are both flexible, meaning delicate as a breeze, but then strong, all right, meaning durable. Okay, we have to know that durable and strong mean the same thing. Uh, A talks about how she makes them, has nothing to do with that claim. B talks about her process, again, which has nothing to do with the claim about them standing strong. And then D, um, again, it has something to do with like what's cool about her art, but does that have anything to do with the fact that they look delicate, but they are strong? No. So that's how we arrive to C for question 10. All right, so question 11 is a very typical command of evidence question. We are asked to directly support the researcher's conclusion. So, what is the researcher's conclusion, right? Their conclusion is that the transition happened 3.2 billion years ago. All right. Now, what do we need to know in order to support that conclusion? Well, they're looking into rocks and they're saying before 3.2 billion years ago, there was no interaction between the lithosphere, which is the crust, and the mantle, which is the magma beneath Earth. Okay. So there were no volcanoes or things like that in early Earth. So, um, you see that up here, and that's why it was immobile, right? Stagnant tectonic regime. All right. So, uh, what would have allowed the transition to happen? Okay, well, the lithosphere is fractured that allow material to mix. Okay. So we need an answer choice that says around 3.2 billion years ago, we start seeing the lithosphere and the mantle mixed. All right. Um, so A says that directly, right? Or I mean, sorry, D. D says that directly. D says specifically that at 3.2 billion years ago, we start seeing mixed mantle and lithospheric rocks, right? Material. But before 3.2 billion years ago, older than 3.2 billion years ago, we see no mixing of the lithosphere and mantle. So that's exactly what we wanted, and that's what D says. All right. Um, A is an opposite distractor, right? Can mantle-derived rocks be seen older than 3.2 billion years ago? No, right? Because looking in the lithosphere, we should see solely lithospheric rocks before 3.2 billion years ago, according to the logic of this research team. All right. Again, B, older than 3.2 billion years ago, has more compositional diversity. It should have less, right? Um, Now, C, positive correlation between the age of lithospheric rocks and their uh, chemistry or something like that, right? Um, this would mean that, well, one, that correlation increasing significantly in strength at around 3.2 billion years ago is kind of weird. Um, but the biggest issue here is that there's a positive correlation between the age of lithospheric rocks and their chemical similarity to mantle-derived rocks would mean that the older a rock is, the older a lithospheric rock is, the more similar they are to mantle-derived rocks, right? So, a 4 billion-year-old lithospheric rock would look just like a mantle-derived rock, but a zero-age lithospheric rock would look nothing like a mantle-derived rock, is what a positive correlation would mean. Okay? That's the opposite of what we would want to state, right? We would want to say that there's greater mixing later on. Okay, so that there's more similarity between lithospheric and mantle-derived rocks after 3.2 billion years ago, because that's when we start seeing uh, the interaction between the lithosphere and underlying mantle. So that's how all the others are wrong and how we arrive to D as correct. Always remember sometimes a straightforward answer, right? Positive correlation sounds kind of more scientific in answer choice C. But if you don't know what that means and then you read D and you see something really clearly supporting the conclusion, just because it sounds more scientific, quote unquote, because it says positive correlation doesn't mean that it's more correct than something that has nothing wrong with it, like D. All right, so question 12 is a logical inference question that's pretty interesting, actually. So basically, the Uto-Aztecan language has a northern and a southern family, okay, or branch, right? So the language family as a whole is very similar, but there's a northern and southern branch. There's similarities across the family as a whole, including botanical terms, meaning plants, suggesting that this was a single language spoken thousands of years ago at one point in the US Southwest, which actually lines up with the Aztec notion that they descended from Aztlan, which was in modern day US Southwest. Um, however, issue here, okay, uh, corn or maize vocabulary isn't shared between the northern and southern branches, even though all of these tribes grew crops, right? Grew corn, I mean. So if corn came from Mexico and went north into what is now the US Southwest, you could think, okay, if while they were up there, corn showed up when there was one language spoken by one group in one area, then after those groups split apart, corn would be the same word across all those places. So it'd have to be sometime after the southern group went south that we would see corn spreading north to the Uto-Aztecan tribes, right? So they would have had to have, corn would have had to come through different avenues than being all there at the same time. All right. So I want to point out some ones which are wrong. A is wrong if this would have been correct if this and this were switched, right? If Northern Uto-Aztecan tribes could obtain the crop directly from a non-Uto-Aztecan tribe, then a Southern Uto-Aztecan tribe, that could have maybe been a good one. But because it's inverse, it can't be correct, right? You would think that they would have the same word if it was introduced by a Southern group. Um, B, this is way too radical of an inference, right? This is not a very safe one. Okay, reflects regional specific methods for cultivating the crop. How do we know that that would change the way that we refer to the term, right? How do we know that that like why wouldn't they already have different botanical language if they were, had different regionally specific methods of anything, right? So um, B is a wild inference. And then C is a little bit uh, unsure, right? So like, how would we know that they came at the same time? We have no idea for that, right? The different sources spot is kind of interesting. I would sort of say that that could be true, but making this specific statement that they must have been arriving at the same time, I don't know how that could be proven here. So finally, D is correct because we use the word preceded, right? Preceded means before. So this division of northern and southern branch must have happened before they were using corn, right? Before they were using maize. Why? Because if they were using maize before they split, they would have had the same language, or they would have had the same word for the thing, because they have the same words for a bunch of different things. However, because the word is so radically different, it means it must have came to them after they'd already split. So that's how we get to D for question 12. All right, so question 13 is a logical inference question that I'm sure you were probably lost on if you're watching this video. Okay, I just want to show the importance of vocabulary in a question that doesn't actually ask us a vocab question. Okay, because it's not a word and context question, but vocab is really important here. All right, why? Because we need to understand what episodic desiccation is just based off of the language of it. Okay, we don't get that technical term defined because it's not really a technical term. Something is desiccated, meaning to be dried to the point of being really dry. Okay. Desiccation is to dry something. Okay. Um, so that's just a word that we should know, actually. It's in our vocab list. So episodic meaning periodic. It's happening over and over again. So uh, there is cracking as a consequence of, I meant to highlight that. Uh, there's cracking as a consequence of something drying up over and over again, right? So um, now that is most of the sediment. So most of the sediment looks like it is cracked, episodically desiccated sand, like material, okay? Mud, we see later. And then there are some intervals of coarse grains. Okay, so what does this mean? Right, it means that. So the intervals of coarse grains, I'm actually gonna highlight the coarse grains in green, are associated with rivers, right? So flowing water are the coarse grains. All right, so that is not the main thing we see there, though it happens. So that means occasionally there must have been rivers. But for the most part, what we see are mudstone, which is slowly deposited by settling out of suspension in low flow water, right? Meaning mud is sitting in water that is not flowing, so a lake or something like that, ocean, and then it settles slowly at the bottom. Then, after it's settled, it must have dried out at some point, right? Because it desiccates over and over again. We have episodic desiccation, meaning this lake, which is producing the mudstone, dries out, then fills up again for a long time, slowly allowing mudstone to fall to the bottom, dries up, fills up again, probably filled up by the occasional intervals of flowing water. All right, so our answer choice is going to need to say that we have lake present long time. It dries up, fills up again, dries up, fills up again. And occasionally we have rivers showing up. You just have pink and green, right? So we have a lake for a long time, good. And it occasionally dried, good. And then there were also periods in which some streams were there, all right? So B has everything we need. Let's look at these other ones. Um, we have water flowing from a distant source. Okay, that's good. But is pink there? No. Instead, we have a wrong one, right? I'm gonna put it in yellow. Prolonged period of dryness that prevented a lake from forming? Nah, we definitely know a lake was there. So prevented a lake from forming is wrong. So that's how we get rid of A. All right. Um, permanently drying we know is wrong. And C, because we know that it was episodic. It dried, it filled, it dried, it filled. All right. Also, we know that the lake was there for a long time. Then finally, D, um, we see that, so the streams experienced occasional drying and the lake did not, isn't right, right? Because What was cracking? The fine grains which are associated with mud, okay? Not the coarse grains associated with rivers. So that is how we can arrive to answer choice B and say that A, C, and D are all wrong. Tricky question. Just got to think logically here, though, right? So that's how we arrive to B for this question. All right, so 14 is a very tricky question. It is a logical inference question, but let's just really clarify what we want to say here, okay? And then we find our answer choice, which works. So basically, text says in the past, earlier on, okay, from 450 BCE, coins are almost entirely silver in Sidon. Okay, so coins made in Sidon, or Sidon, or however you pronounce it, were almost all silver in 450. Um, but by 367, okay, silver is not the primary ingredient in these coins. So because silver went down a lot, which is an issue because traders aren't able to trade coins that aren't primarily silver, there was a confidence crisis in the currency. So they must have made some sort of decision to resolve this issue. What would it have been? Well, to make sure that the coins are now again primarily made of silver. All right. No more filler. Okay. But there's another issue here. Okay. There are persistent, oppressive financial obligations. All right. So these persistent, oppressive financial obligations mean there's some sort of scarcity, okay, in the civilization. So it's unclear how they're going to be able to continue to like they can't just go back to the 450 situation, right? Where it's 98% silver, 1% copper, um, and just have it, be exactly how it used to be. Um, because uh, if they do that with their current coins, they're just using more silver than they can sustainably have, right? So what do? Well, they just are going to have to just get rid of the copper. So let's say they get rid of the copper, all right? What is that going to result in? Little coins, all right? So they get rid of the copper so that silver is the higher thing, the higher proportion. And that's what answer choice B says, right? So the quantity, the absolute value of silver is the same, but the weight drops a lot because they get rid of the copper. Okay. What's wrong with C, for example? The proportion of silver to copper is similar. No good, right? We need the proportion to be radically different. Okay. So if 367 BC said instead 450 BCE, maybe we could choose C, but it doesn't. Okay. A says proclaim the percentage of silver is suitable, right? Um, this word proclaim isn't sufficient, right? Why? Because traders can tell, because there's a yellowish tone, right? So just proclaiming, hey, these things are good, trust me, when they clearly are yellow isn't sufficient, right? And then finally, copper deposits are not good enough, right? We need to have silver because we want to have silver coins. So that is how we arrive to B. Okay, we need to have B for these coins because they need to be silver as opposed to having copper in them whatsoever. So that is how we arrive to B for this question 14. All right, so 15 is the first writing question in module 2. We have a verb tense question. So what we have here is we need the answer choice to be D because it needs to be in the infinitive. Why? Because we already have another verb ahead of it, which is conjugated into the past tense. So now, if decided wasn't there, we would choose answer choice A. But decided, of course, is there. So that's what means we have to use the infinitive form for D. If you missed this question, you probably just missed that word decided, meaning you're not paying enough attention to the text as a whole. When you're working through these grammar questions on the SAT, make sure you read the whole passage, because if not, you're likely to fall for a trap on an easy question to get correct that is also easy to make a mistake. All right, so question 16 here is a grammar question from the writing portion of Module 2 on this test. We're talking about the year 1613, okay? So it means we need to have a past tense verb conjugation, right? What did Prop Cannon did all the way back in 1613? Well, it needed to have malfunctioned in the past. So A means it's in the present, B means it's in the future, and then C means it's past progressive, meaning it started in the past but continued today, right? Like he has malfunctioned for 300 years, right? But in 1613, this prop cannon malfunctioned once, and after that malfunction, no longer did. So we need to use the simple past tense for D. If you're missing this, you're probably moving just too quickly through these or outthinking yourself. Make sure you read the whole text and spend enough time to get the easy questions correct, because that's where we make the most value. All right, 17 is a pretty simple grammar question here. It's asking about punctuation. We want to remember, if we are using punctuation, it has to have a purpose, right? Commas are for lists, or to combine dependent-independent clauses, or to combine independent clauses with fanboys, etc., right? Every punctuation mark has a role. There is no role for any of these punctuation marks here. So A and B would both be doing the same thing here. They both would be creating an elaboration. But remember, before any colon or any dash that's functioning as an elaboration, so dashes have more than one function. But in this particular function, everything before that punctuation mark, anything before an elaboration, needs to be an independent clause. And does this sound like an independent clause? I quote, "Her portrait of novelist Zadie Smith." No, that doesn't sound like an independent clause. That's why we can get rid of A and B. Now, D is wrong because what would that comma be doing? Is this a list? No. Is that a dependent clause to start? No, it's not a clause at all. I don't know what it is, okay? So this, again, we just don't need any punctuation here because it would serve no point, right? A pause isn't a good enough reason for there to be a punctuation mark. Okay, you might be putting that pause there unnecessarily. So that's how we arrive to C for question 17. All right, so 18 is a pretty tricky subject-verb agreement question here, in that we are being asked to figure out what our subject is and our verb is, but our subject is really far away, okay? So what is our subject? A given industry, right? So we have the singular, a given industry. Now, we have all this stuff in between. Water and electricity are two well-known examples that might suggest you were talking about something plural, right? But our subject is a given industry, meaning we're going to have to stay in the singular. Okay. What answer choices are in the singular? Simply answer choice C, right? It, a given industry, it often consists, right? So these would need a plural antecedent. We need a plural subject. Nope. They would be plural. And then this doesn't work either. So that's how we arrive to it often consists, with our subject being a given industry in the singular. So make sure you're really underlining your subject before your verb to figure out how you figure out the subject-verb agreement. All right, question 19 is one of those difficult list questions in which the items in our list have commas within the item. Okay, so this is what we call a complex list or a complex series, meaning items in the list need a comma. So what does that mean? Look here, the U.S. Copyright Office, which registers copyright claims, okay? Because that comma is there within the item in the list, it explains the item in the list. We can't use just commas to separate every item in the list. Why? If we did that, it'd make us think that Carla's responsibilities are to 1, oversee the Library of Congress. 2, manage the Copyright Office. Actually, sorry. We would think her roles would be to 1, oversee the Library of Congress collections. 2, which boast more. 3, manage the Copyright Office. 4, which register. And 5, appoint the US Poet Laureate. Okay, so we know, though, what her actual roles are just going to be the verbs of this list, right? The verbs being overseeing, managing, and appointing. Those have the parallel structure. Those are the verbs. Those are the things that a human can actually do. So to clarify that, each item in the list is going to need to be demarcated, to use a vocab term from elsewhere in the test, with semicolons. So our only answer choice which does that is C. Okay, B would suggest that there are 5 elements in this list as opposed to 3. A would suggest that which boasts more than 162 million items, managing the Copyright Office, would suggest that the Library of Congress's collections manages the Copyright Office, which doesn't make any sense. And then D would suggest that everything after that is an independent clause, but of course it's not an independent clause. So I think D is there to make you think, it can't be C, because you can, if you use a semicolon or a period, they're interchangeable. They are interchangeable if you are working between 2 independent clauses. But once we had the other situation of having a complex list here with commas inside each item in the list, or any item in the list, now all of a sudden there's a new rule or a new role for semicolons that is different from the role that it shares with periods, which is to separate independent clause. So that's how we arrive to C for question 19. All right, question 20 is a question about the placement of a transition with punctuation. So remember, a punctuation can come anywhere in a sentence, so long as it comes with the right clause. So in this case, why are C and D wrong? Okay, both of these are wrong because we have here, to manifest the warm and welcoming atmosphere, we have a dependent clause. Can we connect a dependent clause to an independent clause with a semicolon? No, right? So there's no room for a semicolon here, because we have, with this infinitive starting out, we have a dependent clause beginning our sentence. So the second half of the sentence can't be an independent clause, so therefore we can't separate it out with any sort of semicolon, period, anything like that. Now, between B and A, we need the comma after, though, would be we need the comma after that so that we can see that the though is pivoting from our first sentence to our second sentence, right? Saying that though she uses software creations, she primarily uses watercolors. If we selected B, it would suggest that the pivot is here, saying that this part, the she to watercolors, refutes the manifesting the warm and welcoming part, which doesn't make any sense, right? So that's how we arrive to our correct answer of A for 20. Good punctuation question. That's a little bit tricky. All right, 21 is a really good, really tricky punctuation question from the grammar writing portion of Module 2, Test 397. I assume many of you missed this question. Okay, it's probably not just you who's watching this video that missed this question. A lot of your peers likely missed it too. Why? Students have this penchant for believing that semicolons come before a transition for some reason, but that isn't inherently true, right? A transition can come anywhere within a clause. It can come at the beginning, which would be after a semicolon, right? A semicolon ends or begins an independent clause. It can come in the middle, like we see in D, like we saw in answer choice A for the previous question, right? Or it can come at the end of a clause, like we see in our correct answer, B. We just have to figure out by reading the passage where the meaning makes most sense. Remember, our transitional adverbs function as kind of like a sign in a math equation. You got to make sure the sign goes in the right place to get the proper result. So we have a though. Those pivot, right? They pivot from what came before. They're contrasting. So we need to have to figure out where the contrast takes place. So where's the contrast? Sentence 1 says that they have distinct layers. But then clause 2 says they are not, however, pristine. However, they are hardly pristine. Okay, we need to therefore make sure that our pivot transition comes in that second clause rather than the third clause. Because the third clause, which starts over here, the third clause is wrong because it couldn't be there because this third clause doesn't undermine what came before. It explains how they are not pristine, right? Because it explains how they are not pristine, how on earth could we use a pivot or contrasting information to, transition there? We couldn't, all right? So it has to come at the end of the second clause, which is its own clause because they are hardly pristine is an independent clause, and many chondrites experience blah, 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 blah is its own independent clause. And to separate two independent clauses, we have the options of either a period, semicolon, or a comma to fanboys, and our only option we're given is B with a semicolon in the proper place, okay? C, again, the semicolon needs to come after the though, because that though needs to be in the second independent clause, not the third. So that's how we arrive to B for question 21, which is a tricky question. All right, so question 22 is a really nitpicky, finely differentiated question here. All right, so we can get rid of two answer choices really quickly with a little bit of background work. All right, we have two independent clauses: that the geographic center of North America lay blah, 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 and establishing its precise coordinates proved more divisive or divisive. Okay, those are two independent clauses. So we only have a few options for separating our independent clauses. And B and C don't align with that. B would need a fanboys right here. C would need a comma and a fanboys, or be a period or anything like that. All right, so now we're between A and D. And you may be wondering, okay, well, I know I can use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses, but can't I use a colon as a period? Okay, you can use a colon only to separate two independent clauses, sure. But the only time you can use a colon to separate two independent clauses is if, right, we have our first independent clause and our second independent clause. You can only use a colon to separate independent clauses if the second independent clause elaborates on the information given in the first independent clause. Meaning, it would have to explain or amplify or clarify some sort of information given in the first independent clause in the first sentence, which doesn't happen here. It's actually a full pivot, okay? So because it's a pivot, this is not an elaboration. Now remember, you can always have an elaboration, which is an independent clause, but an elaboration always has to elaborate on, meaning to expand on, to amplify, to clarify what came before. So this is a meaning question. In part, this is a reading question. We are being asked, is this second clause elaborating on something here, or is it something else altogether, right? So that's why D is correct, because D does the proper punctuation mark that you could use, just like A, except it understands that there is no logical relationship in which the second clause amplifies, expands, whatever, elaborates on the clause preceding it. So as such, that is how we're able to go with D and get rid of A, even though A is something that we could do in another situation with different meaning. That's why you always need to read the whole passage when you are on any grammar question, any writing question on the SAT. All right, so 23 is a really good transitions question. It is asking us to understand the logical relationship between these units of information, right? So basically it is saying that the local bubble is responsible for the formation of new stars revealed by a model. All right, so a model shows this, okay? So then our second sentence shows exactly how the model shows why the local bubble is relevant for the formation of new stars. Okay, so this model reveals it. So we are giving information that specifically relates here. All right. Why is hence wrong? Hence means something along the lines of thus. It is a cause and effect transition. It means that our first sentence causes the impact seen in our second. Is that true? No, not in this case, right? Her model doesn't cause how the model reveals it, okay? However, as a pivot, means our next information we need to contrast with what came before, but no, we're just explaining it deeper. And then admittedly is a concession, right? Admittedly would say that while I think these things, I admit that there are certain things that are untrue or something like that, right? I like vanilla ice cream. Admittedly, it is a boring choice. Nonetheless, I like it a lot, right? Admittedly is kind of an undermining concession from the previous sentence. So the only one that's specifying what is going on here, right, is specifically, because it's saying this is exactly how the model does a good job of explaining the local bubble. So that is how we get to D. All right, so if you missed question 24, I suggest you also watch my video for question 23, because I go really in depth about what kind of transition categories we have. Our correct answer here is in particular, which is really similar to similarly, okay? So we are emphasizing or clarifying what something is, okay? So there was a spiking consumer demand for certain grains. In particular, these grains were maize and wheat, right? Alternatively would mean that we're going the opposite of what we expect, but maize and wheat are grains, so it's not alternate. By comparison, it'd be very similar to alternatively, so it kind of doesn't make sense. But regardless, we're not comparing these, we're showing specifics. And second of all would mean that we're given a first claim, cereal grains were more important, and then a second claim, which would need to say, you know, also meat, okay? But that's not what we have here. We're specifying what kind of cereal grains, so that's why we use in particular as our category of transition for 24. All right, question 25 is a really good transitions question in that we're seeing something that isn't the most like commonly used one to that end, but it is correct in that we do have our second sentence, right? The information in the second sentence is a product or consequence of the previous sentence, right? So we have a cause and effect transition. What is our cause? They decided to develop a musical together with female actor friends to have good parts, right? As such, as a consequence of this cause, the effect is they make sure that they did a play where there's 6 queens sharing a role, right? Or 6 queens with the starring role, meaning there's 6 really good roles for women. Okay, so cause and effect. Okay, for example is not cause and effect. It is an emphasis or exemplify transition. We're not explaining or we're not giving an example of how they did this. We're showing how what they did is an effect of their goal. Okay, so this is probably the hardest one to get rid of, but it means that this would mean that it's merely an example of the previous information, but that isn't what we have. In summary would mean that we're coming to a conclusion, right? We're summarizing what came before. We only have one sentence. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. In other words, would be restating what came before. It would be to say, a lot of people don't know what they like. Or in other words, people don't know what they dislike, okay? It would be rephrasing what came before in a new but very similar way to mean the same thing. That is what we have here. We have cause and effect category of transition, which can only be answer choice D. All right, 26 is a good transitions question, a little bit tricky. What we have here is our claim in the sentence before. So we're looking at the second sentence here. The claim is that ferratas are rarely designed to simply reach a summit. Okay, rarely designed to simply reach a summit. Now they favor recreation over utility, aiming to provide a challenging climb or showcase dramatic scenery. Okay, so we want to say something that clarifies that we don't any longer design them to simply reach a summit, where we want to affirm what came before. So more often is that example, okay? On the other hand, doesn't work here because that would need to suggest that we are undermining or contrasting or opposing the previous claim. But in fact, we are underlining or supporting the previous claim. Nonetheless, has the same exact issue as on the other hand, right? It'd be a concession, meaning we're slightly undercutting or disproving the previous claim. But again, we're trying to affirm the previous claim that they are no longer designed to rarely or just simply reach a summit. Additionally would mean that we're given new additional information. But is this additional information? No, it's just an example of information that we've already been presented with. Okay, so that is how we get to more often for this transitions question. All right, so 27 is a really straightforward rhetorical synthesis question. If you missed this, I assume you're just running out of time. We want to indicate the year Yosemite Falls was completed, the painting. So when was the painting completed? 1930. Okay, so which answer choice says that? C. If you miss this question, you are just simply put either running out of time or you are not reading the question carefully. On any rhetorical synthesis question, it's important that you read the text, but the most important thing you read is this question right here, right? Make sure you read what is underlined because that is the most important part of any rhetorical synthesis question. With that, we come to the end of the reading and writing portion for test 397.